Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review and comparison of the premium grade Harbor Freight Doyle versus the more budget grade Harbor Freight Quinn. And for my current subscribers, I didn't go down and just buy these. I was helping some friends out and told them about Harbor Freight's new pliers and convinced them to buy some so I could get a free review and comparison out of them. And that's what I'm doing now. So we have essentially the same matching three-piece sets, or as best as they had. Both of the, actually one would be the 9.5-inch Doyles versus the 9-inch Quinn linesman's pliers. Both of the 8-inch rated needle nose with integrated side cutters, and as well as the matching pair of dikes, although it's an 8-inch out of the Doyle and the best was a 7-inch out of the Quinn. And there's some interesting properties about the measurements that they're using on these pliers. Let's go ahead and start off, give you guys a quick close look. Now they have, out of the Doyle brand, they have two different styles. They have this style with the integrated fish tape puller. Now they aren't just talking about the serrated portion in the back of the jaw of linesman's pliers, which is for grabbing onto the steel cable pulling tape, but they have this cam lock system. So they have a shelf right here, and so you can put the tape through here, like so, and then you use the pliers in this fashion, and what that does is prevents the teeth marks on your tape, and actually I kind of like that idea. So it has this broad cam, you get plenty of gripping force, and it's less damage to the tape, and you can go ahead and pull it using this method, although many times people use this side because when you grip the tape you can grab a hold of both ends of the pliers. As far as the overall quality, these are actually pretty decent. They're all laser etched. They do indeed have a hot rivet. What I find interesting about the more expensive Doyles, I think these were like $17, is they just don't quite have as smooth a finish as the Quinns. Although I'm sure specifically what you're paying for is higher grade steels. There's just hundreds and hundreds of grades of different steels, and that can make a lot of difference in the quality of the tool. And so I believe that's what's happening here, is even though the finish doesn't seem much better or really any different, and sometimes even worse than the Quinns, I believe that these are going to be a higher quality tool steel. And to mention that, when we look at all the Doyles we can see are actually Taiwanese, where all the Quinns are actually Chinese. And so we can do a direct comparison there. What is interesting is even the Chinese tools, you know, their manufacturing equipment has gotten upgraded. They're a much more modernized society. There's no question about it. And you can see that in the evidence of these Quinn tools, because a lot of them are really pretty good. Both of these brands of tools are something where if you printed a different name on them, most people would accept them just for being that brand. As far as, you know, overall, they're pretty competitive. Now, what I mean by that is, versus the kind of rougher finish on that and the sharp edges on the Doyles, what we have here is on the Quinns, they're actually all nicely polished. They have a really nice, really broad surface back in there for gripping fish tape, and it has a real sharp, as you can see there. Actually, I think I can zoom in and you can see that it actually has pretty nicely broached teeth in there. You can see the forging, the flashing, and that's the thick area there. And you can see the metal's actually pretty smooth. Doesn't look too rough or anything, so that's pretty surprising. They also have a nice hot rivet. If this will focus for me, there we go. And the same type of laser etching. What is different is all the exterior grinding and sanding that's happened. So they have this nice smooth finish versus the little bit more rougher finish on these Doyles, which I always thought was, you know, some kind of quirkiness. They also beveled the back of the jaws, which I like, versus having ones which have these sharp edges. The edges on these jaws are actually real sharp on the Doyles, and I should point that out. Another thing I should point out is they're not, you know, perfectly matched. What's odd is these Quinns are really well matched. With the Doyle's jaws, you can see that there's an interesting offset there, and the front teeth don't quite line up properly. Another thing I was going to point out about both of these is they don't have a particularly large wire gap, which is what sets apart linesman's pliers. And so they have small gaps. You can twist wires together without worrying about just smashing and destroying them too much. Also, if we take a look at the cross hatching, there is a difference. The Quinn has just a little bit of cross hatching at the very end, where there is a deeper and more complete cross hatching on the teeth of the Doyle. Anyway, continuing on, here's the needle nose, and it's kind of the same story. Now, when we'll get to the measurements, they have interesting aspects of the measurements. Here's the Quinns. I did notice that on these other smaller Quinn pliers, the rivets weren't quite as tight as the Doyles. So I believe the Doyles are going to have a better, a longer lasting rivet, but we will see. One thing I did want to point out about the Doyles is they do have slightly wider handles than the Quinns, so they are a little more comfortable to use. That is also true when we talk about the linesman's pliers. It's just a little more width, a little broader on the Doyles. Now, both of these are rated as 8-inch needle nose pliers. You can see that there's a pretty big difference. The Doyles are actually a bit larger than the Quinns. We can also see that the Doyles are just slightly thicker. So in this case, there actually are a heavier duty plier. You can feel that in the weight. There's a bit more steel in the handle versus on the Quinns. But what I thought was interesting is they didn't include any kind of gripper in the back of the jaw where they did on the Quinn. And so I thought, well, that's kind of odd. Why would the cheaper one have more features than the more expensive one? Even though this one is built more nicely, it does have, I would say, a more progressive taper on the needle nose, where these are sanded flat until you get close to the end, which in some cases this would actually be a stronger design. So these are just kind of paradoxical as far as pliers are concerned, because in most aspects the Quinns really look like a nicer plier. As far as the broaching is concerned, the Quinns do use a bit of a cheaper, just straight across, but it is really nicely defined, very sharp. The tips, of course, do come together perfectly on these, which I do appreciate. You do get a more expensive, this is an actual crosshatch, and so that is extra cuts, and so that is a little bit of an extra expense. And once again, I'm sure the Doyles are a higher grade steel. And then we get down to the side cutters. Now, they only had 7-inch versions of the Quinns and 8-inch of the Doyles, and indeed, that is correct. The other ones we'll show in a minute, but when we look at these, those are indeed 7 inches long. These are indeed, and that's just the measurement, the tip to end, are indeed 8 inches long. So they're pretty exacting there, and they're pretty nice. They look just like any other style of dikes, to tell you the truth. So it's really just about the quality of the heat treatment and the grade of the steel. But as far as these are concerned, if this set, or this set, quite frankly, had a better name, you know, Proto or Channel Lock or something like that printed on them, you would have a hard time saying that they weren't until you actually got them side by side and finally compared them. But it's surprising, a lot of these tools are really just pretty nice pliers. Now, the other interesting thing is with these needle nose on the Doyles, they're actually 8¼ inch. Well, they're advertised as 8-inch, so you're actually getting another ½ inch. These are also were advertised as 8-inch long nose pliers, and they actually are 8 inches. So it's kind of interesting that they wouldn't advertise these as 8¼ inch for one reason or another. Now, when it comes to the lineman's pliers, the Doyles are 9½ and the Quinns are advertised as 9s, and it even says that right here. So we have 9-inch Quinns versus 9½ Doyles. Yet when we measure the Doyle, I'm coming up with 9¼ inches down there. Well, there we go. Yeah, that looks like about like 9¼ inches. And when I measure the Quinns, we get 9½ inches. So it's kind of odd that maybe they got that mixed up in the marketing department or something, but I think that's just kind of amusing. What is also interesting about comparing these is that they're actually made in different, you know, Taiwanese versus the Chinese, better quality Chinese. And they're supposed to be both pretty good for their price. So really the only way to compare these would just be to cut hard wire to really see which one is made out of a better quality steel. Do similar work to see which one's jaws will hold up. But as far as how these pliers look and feel, it seems like the Doyles are, you know, a little heavier duty, but they just don't have quite as much smooth of a finish, quite frankly, as the Quinns. And for most people, the Quinns, I think, for the price, you can get out of Harbor Freight for $30 or $40 for these 3 pliers, which would be the 3 most common you would want. Just a heavy-duty set of pliers, some needle nose, and some nice cutters. And you'd be out of there $30, $40, and those would work out great for you. If you really use your tools, then I think the Doyles would be pretty competitive to a lot of fairly expensive brands. And the difference would just only show up over long-term use, where the Doyles may have, bend in a certain situation where a Klein's or a Channel Lock or an Ipex would not. But that would take a lot. You could prove it, but it would take a lot of empirical testing, actual material stress testing equipment, so you can bend them and close them and, measure their failure points, measure the hardness of the steels, do durability testing. Obviously, it's kind of empirical, but quite frankly, as far as these pliers are concerned, compared to the stuff Harbor Freight's had before, they're all quantum leap. It's real surprising, and I know they're selling some of these because in the store, they have a bunch of sets of some, and then like these Quinn linesman's pliers, there are only 2 sets left on the shelf. They do have some interesting advertising. I'll go and finish that up with this. There's the long nose pliers. Higher pivot point for better leverage. Precision milled teeth grip evenly in all directions. That's always funny on the needle nose because we're pointing out that they don't have a crosshatch. They have just straight cut, which means they would not hold as well in one direction as they do in the other. And of course, high hardened steel or high shrink steel, basically the same type of thing. All types of cutting. And then on the, there's the lineman's pliers. And on the lineman's pliers, they're advertising for most hardened wire. I'm not going to cut, I have piano wire, but I'm not going to cut the piano wire because that will damage even these. And so I'm not going to do that just to see which ones dent more, especially when they're not my tools. And then here's the advertisement for or what's on the package of the Doyles. There's the long nose pliers. They have a lot of advertising on these Doyles, which seems to be basically repeated by the Quinns. I wish, this is a situation where they should try to distinctify really what makes the difference, because on the shelf, they both, all these tools look pretty dang close to each other. Even though upon real close inspection, you can see that they're definitely made by different manufacturers. They're advertising the plastic dip handles, laser hardened, here's the, cuts most hardened wire on the diagonal cutters, and same thing on the linesman's pliers. We will cut some softer stuff just to see how they do. We've got some 6D nails, and these ought to work pretty well. Make sure it doesn't shoot anywhere. Actually, that cut that pretty nicely. We can see that we don't have any gaps in there. That's actually just a little fiber and it actually cut it pretty nicely. And what about these? Let's see how these do on the same cut. See if they're... Yeah, you can feel it. When you're cutting something like that nail, there is more flex to these Quinns. You could feel them flex, the handles flexing more than you could on the Doyles. The Doyles definitely felt a lot more rigid. One thing I didn't point out is you can see that the Quinns and the Doyles do have slightly different shaped handles. There's an extra little hook on the Doyles, and some people may like that. Let's take a look at these side cutters, see if they're as easy to use. That's not too bad. And it just knocks off a little bit of the carburization on the cutting edge. But one thing I was going to mention is they actually milled out the inside of the jaw on this Quinn, or on the Doyle. It's milled out too, but the Doyle, you can see that it does have smoother and higher quality milling. Let's see how these work. These have a little bit broader handles, so they're going to be a little bit less pressure. Wow, that was actually surprisingly a lot easier on the Doyles. With that 1 inch of length, you could really feel that. So if you're going to get the diagonal cutters, just for the extra inch of length and extra leverage, I'd definitely get the Doyles. In addition to the wider handles, that actually was surprising. Had to squeeze pretty hard on these, where These cutters just went right through it, no problem. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and hoping I could provide a bit more details on Harbor Freight's new pliers and, some of the more common ones that people would buy. And appreciate everybody watching. Please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.